can't be done, there's something in that area that can be. Every state, like Florida Everglades of all places, has a medicinal plant. So, there's something for everyone in every single state. It's just getting involved and getting your hands dirty and, doing it.
Welcome to today's episode of ATTRA's Voices from the Field. I'm Eddy Labus, NCAT Sustainable Ag Specialist, and I'm joined today by Joe Boccardy, better known as Joe Ginseng. Joe has a small farm nestled in the mountains of northwest North Carolina, where he cares for a small herd of Scottish Highland cattle, pigs, and chickens. Joe farms the forest on his farm, raising several different types of threatened or endangered species like ginseng and golden seal. Good morning, Joe.
Good morning, Eddy.
I'm excited to talk to you today about the Appalachian forest and the plants you care for and preserve. I know that the preservation of the mountains and the rivers in the high country of Appalachian is important to you, as well as the culture here. We will be focusing today on forest farming in the central and southern Appalachian region, but I think many other areas have the potential to grow some of these crops. So to start with, can you give me a little bit more about the background about yourself? You didn't grow up in the Appalachian Mountains or on a farm. How did you arrive at Up the Creek Farm?
Yeah, I can give you the short and easy version of that. I didn't grow up on a farm, no, but I did. Dad was a fisheries biologist with the Department of Interior, and we grew up around fish hatcheries, which the trout fish hatcheries are usually in the mountains, and grew up from Massachusetts, and we just tracked fish hatcheries through Pennsylvania and Connecticut, Virginia, and eventually Dad took a job in D.C., which he did not like the bureaucracy or the paperwork. He wanted to get back in the field. And I ended up going to Florida, which we all did not like that because it didn't have the mountain vibe. And I went to high school down there, and I joined the military, spent some years in the military. And when I got out, all I wanted was the mountains again. And first thing I did, I was sitting on my tank in Iraq, and I remember this guy said, when I get out of here, I'm going to Boone, North Carolina, and go to Appalachian State University. And there was a ring to it, and I'll never forget it. We're eating out of our MREs, and when he said it, I said, Boone, never heard of Boone, and Appalachian State, and that sounded great. And as soon as I got out, I headed up to check Boone out, and I loved it. And I knew that's where I wanted to be, and I haven't left. I went to school at Appalachian State, and how I ended up at Up the Creek Farm and getting a farm. Well, we're deer hunters in our family, and all that traveling in the mountains. Dad would, ever since I was a young kid, he'd take me and my brother out deer hunting. And when I was going to ASU, during deer season, there was lots of game management areas around, and I'd hunt deer. And at the time, land was somewhat more affordable than it is now, and thank goodness. But we had the foresight to go ahead and grab up 30 acres that we saw back in the mid 90s, and that was going to be a spot that we could deer hunt from. And once Dad and Mom and we bought the raw land, within a year or two I started farming. I didn't know what to grow. Yeah, that's how we ended up with the land. And if you want to hear more about how I got into ginseng, I can elaborate a little bit further.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about how you discovered that plant and fell in love with it.
Well, back then we didn't have Google. We didn't have cell phones. I mean, we were just starting to come out with it. It was more books in the library, or I came across, I always was a collector of field guides and nature resources. I've got a whole library of books and books and books. And my dad used to say, buy them books, and all you get is a library. I remember him saying that. And one of my books had Peterson's Field Guide to Medicinal Plants, and I was working as the director of a Boy Scout high adventure base called Camp Daniel Boone. And this friend of mine and I, we had this competition of like who could learn more plants. And we started, we'd come back and, we'd be trail guides on one trip together, and he'd he'd know plants that I didn't know, or I'd know plants he didn't know, and then we started cross-referencing these plants we were learning with Peterson's medicinal plant guy. We had the Peterson's, well, it was Newcomb's field guide is what I learned the plants from, and then I cross-referenced it over to the medicinal plants, and I was learning all of the uses, and this just blew my mind of all these different uses of certain plants, like the like the ghost pipe. I remember that was such a unique, plant, a chlorophyll lacking plant that was popping up everywhere in the Pisgah National Forest. And I remember it was, the Cherokee had uses for it that the early whites started learning. And then I somehow came across this ginseng plant. And, I kind of compartmentalized it back of my brain, and it always just kind of had this certain ring to ginseng. There was this mystery behind it, and these thousands of years of use by the Chinese. And, just with all these other plants, for some reason, ginseng just stood out. Well, several years later, one of the last workers at the Wilcox Drug that did all the fur trading and herb and root buying in Boone. There's even a historical plaque there on King Street about Wilcox. Well, he used to work with Wilcox, and this guy, Chuck, he hired me to go to the swamps of Florida to buy saw palmetto berries. And I didn't know anything about saw palmettos. I didn't know anything about I knew the Everglades. I'd paddled through them, but I didn't know anything about. I knew that it was grown in wild lands of Florida and South Florida, just vast expanses of saw palmetto. They were everywhere. But then in the middle of this plant was a bundle of berries, these bright orange berries. But for years, this has been used for prostate health. Serenoa repens. I forget the genus and species of it. Serenoa, I believe it is. But these pickers would go out into these very hostile areas. And when I say hostile, I mean like rattlesnakes and scorpions and hornets' nests and alligators and copperheads and timber rattlesnakes and everything, every bitter critter this country has is in South Florida. And the first day on my job, I saw a coral snake slithering through the pallets in the warehouse. And these pickers would go out and they'd come in. Some would be on bicycles with bags full of these slimy berries, and they'd dump them into a scale, and I'd pay them in cash. And they had like thousands of dollars. I went to the bank one day and for Chuck, and I picked up $50,000 in cash from the bank, and it was gone in 2 days on the amount of cash we're spending on these berries. I had to go back to the bank to get more money, and I'd just sit at this scale, and they'd come in on bikes or buses. Some of them had lawn seed bags full of berries on a trailer pulled by a school bus full of pickers. And this is August in the Everglades, and this is
that had to be tough.
I did that for a couple seasons, and got pretty close to Chuck. But I realized doing that how much money was being spent on a plant that was used for medicine. And it wasn't American companies that were buying that. The majority of people that were coming over with leather suitcases were Germans and Italians, and there were Europeans that wanted this berry that wasn't grown anywhere in the world that they were producing medicinal products out of. Had a great experience doing it. It was very, we stayed in crappy hotel rooms and ate crappy food and crappy accommodations, but there was an excitement to it. Anyway,
similar to the ginseng trade.
Yeah, I guess so. Chuck ended up tearing a building down, and in the bottom of this building, he had some seed. And I said, "What's in that bag?" And he said, "There's 30 pounds of ginseng seed. You want it?" And I was like, "How much?" And he said, "Well, I'll sell it to you cheap." And so he said, "It's probably got a low germination rate." And that 30 pounds was back in 99 or 2000. And at the same time, I'd read the book Green Gold by Scott Persons on ginseng. And I was so excited, but I had no idea what was going to come out of that 30 pounds and what would lead to more and more planting and harvesting. And years later, a podcast or a interview or a workshop or whatever, is, I'm glad that plants are finally getting some kind of, people looking up to them for their health benefits,
Right. Thank you. So the Appalachian Mountains are certainly a place that I'm passionate about and love, and the unique culture of the forest here and those plants. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of the other plants that are grown in our region that has value besides ginseng? And I know we're going to talk a lot today about ginseng, but there's some others that really cause some concerns for being endangered or overharvested. Can you tell us about them?
Yeah, I can tell you about them. I mean, there's golden seal, there's the cohoshes, there's very unique little plant called fairy wand or false unicorn, some people know it as. Just about every what we call the spring ephemerals has some sort of medicinal use out of it. Even, everybody's very familiar with these ramps that is about to pop up. They've got medicinal usage for them, and of course they're culinary. Everybody wants them for the flavor of the culinary world. And the biggest thing is some of these plants are easily identified, and there's value to them. And we've got a cultural tradition in the mountains of people, digging something of value, and very little. I mean, it's growing, but there's very little care for future generations of these plants that have this value. They want to dig what they can because it's whatever they can put in that sack is weight or mass that goes with more money. Unfortunately, we also live in an economically depressed area of the states. There's not a lot of industry or a lot of jobs. There's people that are just surfing paycheck to paycheck, and they know that some of these plants are out there, and they also have no care for boundaries of what they can take. So they'll take as much as they can, and they'll go home with it and sell it for whatever they can get for it.
Yeah. So do you see the potential for small farms with smaller woodlots, to incorporate forest farming and forest medicinals as an economic addition to their farm?
Oh, of course. Yeah. And I think that that's probably going to be one of the factors played in the survival of some of these species of endangered plants is people with a passion for these plants that care about them want to, start their own crops and planting ginseng, golden seal, cohosh, and they've got these woodlots that aren't used for much else other than maybe some firewood. So it's not like they're cultivating the land in other areas, but they could be using it for livestock or field-grown plants like vegetable production. And they're also long-term plants. And once you get them in the ground, it's really minimal maintenance, which is another appealing factor that I had that was part of the reason I got into them. Is you don't have to weed them or maintain them the way you do broccoli or onions or garlic or tomatoes. You get them in there, you get them started, and they kind of take care of themselves over time.
So for somebody that's looking to get started in forest farming, they've got a small woodlot. What are some advice you would give concerning soils, location, seeds, and then certifications?
What I was lucky with was, and I didn't know it at the time, it was so long ago, but some of these species love a high calcitic index in the soil. So if you've got your maples or your poplars, those are some identifiers, natural identifiers that you've got a higher calcium level in the soil. And the reason you want that is there's a lot of diseases that come with ginseng, not so much with golden seal. Ginseng, especially if you're speaking of ginseng, especially when you plant a monocrop of it, like with anything else, it can get its pests and its diseases. And so with calcium in the soil, it helps with the natural immunity of the plant to battle these diseases like botrytis or alternaria, which can really wipe out the crop. You want to have a nice, well-drained soil. You don't want any soupy wet, something that stays wet for a while. These plants can do okay in sporadic sunlight, but not too much sunlight. And you also don't want too much shade either. If it's a very dense canopy, then it might not do too well, because one of the biggest secrets to it all is you really want a lot of airflow. Some people say east-facing slopes, north-facing slopes, northeast-facing slopes. Personally, I think they all do well as long as you've got great air circulation around the plants and good drainage in the soil, and you don't plant them too close together. You also want to find a good source of seed or propagated cuttings, and those are available through. I belong to multiple Facebook groups. Everything from the wild diggers to people that are growing it, medicinally, like I am. And so some of these people have propagated sets of like golden seal rhizomes. Golden seal, you can actually, ginseng too, if you're careful with it, you can cut and you can propagate cuttings out of these roots and then replant them. You can take what you need and then replant the root, and the plant doesn't die. I haven't done that too much with ginseng, but with golden seal, I've done it a lot. Golden seal spreads more like a rhizome. It spreads out across the top layers of the soil and puts out little buds. And once one gets big enough and has some terminal buds on it, you can cut that, propagate it. You can do that with fairy wand too. You can do that with black cohosh. You can do it with bloodroot. Some of these roots actually have other nodes on them that you can cut a piece, and as long as you have a terminal node on the surviving cutting, you can put it back in the soil. It'll grow.
So would you advise them to find a local source of ginseng? Or I know there's a lot of sources out there from Wisconsin and Canada where it's commercially grown. Can you take that kind of seed and get, your woodlot started?
You can, I haven't done any studies on, it takes a long time to study something that grows a long time, but I would caution, it's always better to find something that's acclimated to the environment it's going to be growing in. And some of the commercial growers in Wisconsin and Canada and Michigan that are up there, they grow under shade cloth, and it's a totally different type of growing than it is. What I do is wild simulated. And so I should have clarified that early on. Is wild simulated is exactly what it says. You're growing it as naturally as possible, just like it would be growing in the wild. And with cultivated ginseng, you're going in there and you're tilling up nice loose beds with a tiller or cultivating equipment. You've got artificial shade with cable run shade cloths that are, over acres and acres of ginseng. And this also affects the value, because when you grow a root in the wild with the traditional, many of our exports, the majority of the export of ginseng goes overseas to China. They want American ginseng. That's a very valuable trade, is wild American ginseng. But if you show a buyer a wild-grown ginseng root versus one that's been grown in a fluffy, beautiful bed that's been fertilized and fungicides have been used, and all these amendments, and they've been grown under the perfect shade, well, those roots look totally different. Like the one that's been cultivated, you're going to have big fat roots with a whole lot of tendrils coming off of them, and it's going to look like a beautiful root. Don't get me wrong. But the wild grown root is going to be gnarly, and the neck scars are all going to be wrinkled up, and it's definitely going to show that it's really struggled through the years. Now, if you take, which I've done this, and you take a root grown wild and a root grown under shade, and you put it in a lab and you test the ginsenoside content, which is a medicinal, that's the stuff, that's the constituent, is what they call it, the ginsenoside. And there's multiple ginsenoside in the root. That shade grown cultivated root is going to be the bottom of the barrel of medicine, whereas a wild grown root that struggled through storms and weather and all kinds of diseases and pests, and that thing's going to have a high ginsenoside content, which is why it's much more valuable. So, I'm doing small batch ginseng, and I'm not on a massive scale. These people in Wisconsin and Canada are harvesting thousands of pounds, tons of ginseng to sell it maybe $12 a pound. I'm selling, I personally don't sell my dried roots like I used to, or what I started this as, but the diggers that are digging it, the $700-800 a pound. Same plant, same roots, just grown totally different. So you're talking $12 a pound to $700 to $800, sometimes $1,200 a pound. Depends on the year. It depends on supply and demand shifts. But it's a huge difference in price.
Right. And I think one thing you were touching on earlier, that this is a long-term crop, so you're not having any kind of annual cash flow. In an article I was reading called "Appalachia's Ginseng Gold Mine May Not Last Much Longer," it was talking about the leaves of the ginseng plant that were harvested and the potential to have more ginsenosides in it than the roots. Do you think that's going to open up some more economic or annual cash flow for small farms?
For small farms, yeah, that's a great opportunity. If you can get involved, I'm talking to someone, and I've done a couple tea blends with the leaves because it's more sustainable. You can pick. The problem with you still can't get a huge supply because you can't pick all the leaves off one ginseng plant. That's where it gets that's how the root grows under the ground. So it needs a certain amount. So you can, with ginseng, you'll hear of 2-prongers or 3-prongers or 4-prongers, but those prongs come with the age of the plant. So a 2-pronger might be a 2 to 3-year-old plant, depending on the season that it had to endure. 4-pronger, you usually start seeing those in 4 or 5 years. But I wouldn't pick all 4 prongs, all 4 leaves off that plant. It grows up for the central stalk. There's in the central stalk, a pod of berries comes out of the middle of it, and then around that there's a whorl of leaves that comes around, and those are called the prongs. And with 4 prongs, if you took all 4, you're pretty much going to give zero growth or nutrition to that plant. And then there are, to answer your question, there's a lot of ginsenoids in the stem and the leaves, and you can use that for medicine. You can use that to sell as an additional product, which I've done. I'll pick the leaves and I'll dry them out and sell them to someone who's making tea blends out of it. But it still doesn't have the allure of the root. All of these plants have uses, and I'm hoping that with small farmers getting into this type of plant production and stewardship of endangered species, then we will have that in our own shelves and our own apothecaries, that we can spread that knowledge and spread that passion to other people, that they see value in this plant.
It sounds like the value added potential, somebody that's keeping that plant locally, selling it in the country, is that going to be more valuable, or do you still think it's just going to be one of those export markets?
Well, I think it's going to be an export market for a long time, but with more and more people, it's like I said, it's a long-term crop. I chose to go with value added because I started getting, my partner's a clinical herbalist, and I like to make the medicine. So, if I can take my own roots and turn that into a tincture or turn that into a tea, then I'm going to get more value, because I'm looking at, a pound of roots that are 20 years old, and I'm getting $750 for 20 years of growth. Yeah, if you've got multiple acres of it, that sounds great. But, you've just dug up 20 years of your work, and I'll get more value when I put it into little tincture bottles with a pretty label on it. And, that people can use it. It's more easily used than just a dried root. It's ready to use straight out of a dropper bottle on your tongue, rather than, how do I use this root? And it's not like a root that you can find in the grocery store. It's not like, some people do cook with it, but still yet, there's uses of this plant that go back for many, many years in Chinese culture, and the wisdom that was used by these emperors to gain uses of that plant. I mean, for instance, there's a cancer doctor in Maryland, I can't remember his name. He was treating his patients with ginseng, and he saw that a lot of his patients, I cannot remember his name. He has a ginseng company now. And for some reason, Harding, I think it's Harding Ginseng. He started his ginseng company simply because he saw that the ones using ginseng through treatment were the ones that were surviving and not returning. And so, this plant has this power of years of growth and this thing called a ginsenoside that's helping that body to adapt to these stressors that we live in this very toxic world of pollution and chemicals, and our water is dirty and our food is dirty, but these are all stressors on our system. The ginsenoside helps the body to overcome some of these things, and whether it's can't say it's the fountain of youth or it's healing us, but it's helping us to get by. And it's like that quote from Yellowstone where John Dutton says to Beth, she's going through one of her tirades. He said, "Beth, life's already hard. You don't need to make it any harder." Life's with ginseng teas or ginseng tinctures, it just helps to level it out a little bit. And unless you use it on a regular basis, you don't understand really what I'm talking about when you overcome an illness earlier than somebody else might, or you just seem to be doing okay through a really stressful time in your life. And it's kind of this mystery, snake oil, I guess you could say it. It's the mystery. It's the mystery thing. And Daniel Boone, the Cherokee didn't even use this plant until the whites started coming. And the reason the whites started digging it in the first place were because, and I say the whites meaning the colonialists that came in and took lands and took animals and took the beavers and took the buffalo, and a Jesuit missionary what happened to be in China in the mid 1700s, and he saw that plant and he saw how much respect and reverence for this plant, and he came back to, I believe, Quebec, and he saw it growing there. And since their trade was a big thing with trading in pelts and hides, and everybody wanted something in Europe from this new America. Well, since he saw that ginseng plant was so abundant here, when the Native Americans and the frontiersmen were out taking as much as they could from this land full of all these resources, they just started digging ginseng as well, because it was right there along their paths of travel, and they dug it in excess. Boone was even reported to have lost 10 tons of this in the Ohio River on a barge that, sunk. So, you're talking about a plant that can live who knows how long. I've got 25-year-old plants, and there's plants in the wild that I've heard can live up to over 100 years. So we don't really know how long this plant can live. And there's not many, perennial plants that do this kind of thing, like a tree,
right.
We don't know how old those plants were that Boone dug up, because no one was using them at the time. And so over the years, there's less and less of this. I know that in the past 20 years, I feel like there was a dip, the wild digging of it, because I know that the grandfathers and the older fellas that were, living on the farm and used to do the tradition of digging, there wasn't so many diggers out there that were just, living off the land and digging what they could.
So the article I referred to before stated concerns around overharvesting and addressed thefts to wild and wild simulated. In that article, you were quoted, "If thieves found my patch, they'd be in hog heaven out here digging it up." Have you seen an increase in thefts in the area or on your patch? And what are some regulations for harvesting ginseng?
Well, Watauga County was a pioneer in getting ginseng stealing ginseng to become a felony. Thank God it's now a felony to dig ginseng in North Carolina anyways. I have not seen anybody poaching on my property since one fellow years ago when when I first planted that 30 pounds, I did find somebody with one of those, those old cloth mail bags. When he started running, he got rain down upon. I happened to be squirrel hunting at the time, and we rained down upon a little bit of heavier rain pellets than normal might have rained down upon him, and he never came back. But now it's 2025, and we've got these high-tech cell phone cameras that go right to your phone. I've got signs all over the farm that say "Smile, you're on camera." The purple paint that goes on fence posts is everywhere. It says no trespassing, no hunting. You don't want to talk about where your patch is to everybody. I'm lucky enough that it's on a protective slope where it's easily seen. I do know people personally that have had lots of plants stolen from them. Unfortunately, cameras are the way. Cameras, investing in a good quality camera that will report back to your cell phone, or and even fake cameras. You can get for $6 on Amazon. You can get 2 of these plastic cameras that flash a red light. They help deter thieves. I think that they come if you have an open patch, and this one fellow I'm speaking of in particular is the nicest old man. And I hate that he got hit the way he did, but he had a patch in the woods up on Big Horse Creek, and he showed it to me. He showed it to a couple others, and he even told me it was his grandkids' college fund. It's beautiful plants. I mean, when you can get your hands on them every day, and you can make sure they're just gorgeous plants. Well, the thieves, they like to come on the full moon, on a clear full moon, when you don't need a headlamp. You can see everything in the woods, and especially if it's rained really hard for a few days before that full moon. If you got that combination, that's when you really need to be careful, because the ground is soft, the roots are easy to dig, and they don't need a headlamp. They can get in there and they can dig all night long if they want to. And that's why cameras are always there. And if you let people know there's cameras there, when they come onto your property with signs saying "Smile, you're on camera," it's a pretty good deterrent. I haven't had any problems. I hope to never have any problems, because when you've been growing something for as long as I have, it gets kind of personal.
Yeah, for sure. So I noticed in that article, it really surprised me that some states don't have any kind of laws or regulations on ginseng. And because I was reading, I'm wanting to say it was Pennsylvania, it's not considered a crop. So if somebody steals it, it's like them picking up a stick. So there's not a lot of these regulations. And I know from experience, these thieves go in before the ginseng harvesting season, which is generally September 1st.
Right.
And so they get it before, you've been waiting, and then all of a sudden they're in there and your patch is gone. What kind of organizations or groups could people look at that they could become active to protect these plants?
Well, there is a group that I belong to called Forest Farmers of Appalachia, Beginning Forest Farmers, and it's a small group considering. I mean, there's probably 1,000 members in it, but with these groups and belonging and getting involved, the United Plant Savers does some advocating for endangered plants. They're out of Ohio. I don't know. I think the Fish and Wildlife Service, listing it as an endangered plant. I don't know what the future of that will be in terms of, protection for that plant, and it is theft, and it should be punishable. But deterrence is really what a landowner has is some type of surveillance, a guard dog, planting it in a spot that's not out in the middle of nowhere to where anybody can come in and get it whenever they want. Being picky about that. There's not much protection for it. I know that there's still people that get caught yearly. You hear about them on the Blue Ridge Parkway, which is a national park, and that's our linear park. And they'll come from out of town, and they'll just step out of their car, park on the side of the road, and go looking through the woods for ginseng, and that's a federal offense. We have acres and acres of forest lands that are virtually unprotected by, there's not enough rangers to be out checking people. Game wardens are concerned with bear and deer, and but they're also, part of their job is protect the plants. And unfortunately, they don't know any better. Somebody could have a backpack full of ginseng, and as long as they don't have a gun in their hand, they're good to go. So there's not much protection for some really critical plants, other than getting involved and starting to grow it yourselves. Another reason, like I said, small farms are an important piece of the puzzle to keeping these things around.
Right. And it kind of, for some of us that like to be in the woods by ourselves, it's kind of one of those crops that you just keep to yourself and go
You just
enjoy
keep
it.
to yourself. Yeah.
And I was reading that I think in the Pisgah National Forest, like they use some dyes that they inject in these plants so that the root changes color to help alleviate or protect those plants. So as we're talking to people that's looking to get started or maybe have been started a year or two, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you have seen and just kind of those two or three things that you would advise people to avoid or to do?
One thing I didn't realize was how much work went involved. It's not like a planting your carrot seeds. There's a lot of work on what I call non-tillable areas. I mean, you can't get equipment in there, so everything's done by hand. Whether you're chainsawing dead trees out of the way, or raking the top layers of detritus back to get to the ground to plant the seeds, every single thing is done by hand. Hand tools, hand labor. Digging it up is not easy to dig a root up. If you're digging roots, you don't want to be breaking the roots as you dig them. These things have been growing. You want to keep them intact. So they got a lot of, roots, lateral roots go off to the side. All of that's part of the medicine of the plant. All of these plants have hand labor involved. And so you've got a lot of time, a lot of money goes into labor. The materials aren't nearly as much. Getting into shade grown, you're dealing with materials with shade cloth and cables, which can be expensive. But in terms of forest grown woodlots, the majority of the biggest mistake I made is underestimating the amount of labor that went into this. The other mistake I made was not realizing until later years how much damage I was getting from pests like rodents, moles, shrews, voles, turkeys eating the seeds. You really need to be in there more than you think, protecting the seed crop. I put those little decorative jewelry bags that you get at weddings, little potpourri bags. I put those over each seed head. In terms of voles and shrews, there's repellents that I put out. There's solar they make vibrating sounds in the ground that they go out when the new seed goes in. You don't really know how much you're losing until a couple years go by and you see the holes that are forming in the beds. That was the second mistake I made. So you need to be aware of the disease and the pests that each plant species have, as well as your deer population. There's certain areas I haven't had any problems until here recently. The past couple of years, I've seen more of an increase in deer damage, which they don't kill the roots, but if they bite the tops off, that's it for the growth cycle for that year. And if you've got a strong deer herd and they have a browse line, and they're in the woods where they're protected, they're eating everything in there. They're like a goat, and they'll just eat everything around them. And they seem to, in some of my groups that I belong to on Facebook, I've seen where in Ohio and West Virginia, they have tons of problems with deer. And so I've been a little bit more prudent about making sure I kill more deer out of that area than other areas. I'll make sure I harvest more does, or I'll make sure if people are coming to hunt on the farm that they kill a doe before they go waiting for 6 does to go by before they kill a buck. I'm trying to limit that deer herd down.
Right. Now, I know a couple of years ago, you were looking at a product that was an organic product for a deer repellent that was made from sheep lanolin.
Yeah.
How did that work?
It worked great. It definitely stuck longer than I thought it would. And, I didn't have any video proof that the deer weren't eating it. But you never know, unless you are there watching it and you have a deer that's standing in it, not eating the ginseng and eating something else. So I'm assuming it worked. So I say it worked great, but I just didn't have that level of deer damage that I did the year before. It was sheep lanolin, yes. And I forget the name of the commercial blend of it, but I mixed mine with a little bit of dish soap and water and sprayed it on the plants.
Yeah. Is there anywhere in the Appalachian region that's doing research or making any advancements to some of these pests and diseases on ginseng?
Maybe, not that I know of. I mean, there could be some out there. I feel like myself and a few others in these small groups are where I get my knowledge from. Perhaps.
Right. Yeah. So that kind of brings me down as we're winding down here. Do you have a favorite book or a website that, for somebody who's just listening today that's never really heard of ginseng or golden seal or any of the cohoshes, that they could refer to? What's your go-to Bible for forest medicinals?
The most updated and best book that I could recommend is Janine Davis's, and she wrote it with Scott Persons, who's the guy that wrote Green Gold, is Growing and Marketing Ginseng, Golden Seal, and Other Woodland Medicinals. Growing and Marketing Ginseng, Golden Seal, and Other Woodland Medicinals. They put a lot of work into that. Janine works at NC State at the Research Center in Mills River, North Carolina, and she's dedicated her life to medicinal plants and alternative agriculture. And she's taken her life's work and compiled it in this wonderful book. And even though I've been growing that plant for so many years, I still turn to Janine Davis and, use her and her knowledge. And I would recommend it to anybody wanting to get into these kind of plants.
Okay, thank you. Well, Joe, thank you for the conversation today. I always enjoy talking to you. We always go somewhere and visit and find something, new to talk about, and always learn something. You've been so kind to allow veterans programs and hosting other field days out there. And everybody that's ever been has just been amazed at your farm. And I really want to thank you and appreciate you helping to preserve these plants that's so important to Appalachia. And I know they can be grown in other places. I get calls from people, in Georgia and Alabama that want to grow ginseng, and it can be done.
If it can't be done, there's something in that area that can be. Every state, like Florida Everglades of all places, has a medicinal plant. So, there's something for everyone in every single state. It's just getting involved and getting your hands dirty and, doing it.
We appreciate your information and look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Eddie. It's good talking to you too.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at attra.ncat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. ATTRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATTRA Sustainable Agriculture Program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.